Today at Speedy's Garage, we're going to go from this to this. So stick around and see how it's done. I started to notice the 16-year-old headlamps in Project SportRunner were looking a bit dim, even the high beams. And I think I became spoiled by the HID projector headlamps in my other vehicles. So to remedy that, today at Speedy's Garage, we're going to be installing an HID projector retrofit kit on Project SportRunner. Start with the projectors. We've got the bulbs. I went with these square shrouds to go over the projectors to make it look nice. Came with two igniters, the two XB35 computers, and these are nice. They're actually aluminum housing. I was pretty impressed with that. Wiring harness, and then I did a couple of extra little things. I wanted to go with some additional lighting to kind of customize it a little bit. So I did some halos and some strips. And these are switchbacks, so you have a couple of options based on how you wire it up with this white and orange wire, and I'll talk about that later. But they'll light up either amber or bright white. I also picked up a little bit of the resealing glue just in case I needed it. It was 12 bucks for the whole roll, so I figured it would be nice to have some on hand just in case I needed to put everything back together. Everything showed up in like 48 hours, which is very quick shipping and extremely well packed. And I'd like to be able to do this while leaving the factory headlights in the truck. So I'm going to go down to the local pull-apart and see if I can't find some 2000 to 2002 headlights off of a salvage vehicle. I'm taking some screwdrivers, socket set, and my battery-powered ratchet. Hopefully get some headlights for cheap. Well, someone beat us to it, so that's not going to work out. We're going to try another place. Alright, so we struck out on the salvage yards. I couldn't find any headlights. I went to a second salvage yard. They only had one. It was from a 99 4Runner. I don't think it would have even worked. And the guys wanted 50 bucks for it. I mean, that's crazy for a salvage yard headlight. So we're going to punt and either use the factory ones, or we're going to go check online on eBay and some other online sources and see if we can find some there. So I picked up these aftermarket lights for a couple of reasons. Number one, I figure the plastic on the factory ones is 16 years old. It's going to be brittle and very likely to break while I'm working with it. I'm hoping that a new set would be more pliable and maybe have less issues. Number two, I'm planning to paint the bucket on the headlight to give it a little bit of a custom touch. That means I'm going to need to paint the corner lights to match. So that's the reason I picked up the aftermarket corner lights. And the whole set of lights was actually pretty cheap, so I don't see any downsides to spending a few bucks to do it this way. Now, if you're just going to stick the projector in the chrome housing and leave it chrome and not do any customization, you can just do that. And obviously you won't need the corner light since you're not changing any colors or anything. But like I said, I like to customize things as I'm building them, so that's what we're going to do. And to do this, I almost broke out the paint gun and went and had some custom paint mixed up in this color and used a real automotive clear. But when I talked to the guy at the paint shop, it was going to be pretty expensive to mix that paint up. And I don't think it would have been worth it since it's behind glass anyway. So I'm just going to go the rattle can route and we'll be good to go. I'm going to use my digital thermometer gauge for baking the lights, a piece of wood for setting the lights on it in the oven, and some gloves so I don't burn my hands when I'm working on them when they come out. And since I'm going to have the grill off anyway to work with the headlights, I decided to update this Toyota emblem on the grill at the same time from a little bit more modern Land Cruiser. I'm also going to use a couple of clamps as well as some of these plastic panel tools. And finally a little bit of fishing line because I'm a belt and suspenders kind of guy. I received 2 halos and 2 strips as I showed a second ago. When I opened the packages, one of the halos had this really nice loom already installed on both the halo as well as the driver, and that's great. Neither of the strips had any loom installed on either the driver or the strip, which was a little bit disappointing. And the other halo didn't have it installed either. So you can see the difference there. Nice loom, no loom. And I definitely would never install any wiring on a vehicle without it being protected, so that's something I'll have to take time to do myself. Okay, so I wanted to do a little bench test on these LED strips to make sure, first of all, that they work, but second of all, to see how bright they were. So I just plugged in the drivers. Black is ground, white makes it light up white, orange makes it light up amber. I'm using my trusty power probe. It can provide 12 volts. You just hook it up to a 12 volt source. I'm going to ground the ground wire using the power probe's auxiliary ground. And now when I provide 12 volts to this white wire, it should light up white. And it does. And it's really bright. Very good quality LED. Now let's try amber. Now you see how it kind of did a step there? It starts off real bright, and after a couple of seconds it drops back a step. These are the updated switchback LEDs from Morimoto, and that step back allows these to run in amber mode full time if that's what you want to do. Now let's check the ring. Same deal. Amber is amber, white is white, black is ground. So we're going to connect the ground. Yeah, that's bright. Now try amber. And notice how it has that same step. I don't know if you can see it on the film here, but it just drops back just a hair in intensity, and that's to make the LEDs live so they can run full-time amber if that's what you want to do. I'm going to start by disassembling the headlight. This is the aftermarket headlight. I'll go after this spring first. Next, I'm going to remove the adjusting nuts in the back, and I did mark their positions with a Sharpie, and I'm going to count the number of turns. I don't know that it matters. It's a 10mm nut. I don't know that it matters, but just in case it does, I'm going to set them back to these exact positions when I put them back together. So I'm going to count the turns as I take these off. There's 2, 3, and when you've loosened each one a few turns, I did them about 10. It puts a little tension on this tab back here, and I'll use a needle nose pliers to release that. I'll just squeeze it together and it should pop out. With that popped, go ahead and finish these. 24, 25. So each one took about 25 turns. Now I'm going to write that next to each one of them so I remember. That was 25 and that one was 23. Next, I'm going to take off the rubber boot. I'll take out the bulb, which is going to take a small flathead screwdriver. I'm sorry, Phillips head screwdriver. Next, I'm going to remove the spring from the housing. I'm going to remove the rest of the adjuster assembly. I marked the bottom one, the black one, B, in case I forget which one was bottom and which one was top. Well, I said I was going to remove the little vent hoses, but they're actually glued to the housing, so they're going to have to stay, and I hope they survive the oven. If not, we'll figure something out. I am going to take this little plastic cap off here, and this is a metal stud, so I'm going to remove that. You may not have to, but just in case. Easy enough to do. Now I believe we're ready to put it in the oven. One thing I should mention, there are clips on the headlights to hold the glass lens in place as the adhesive sets. You can take these off after you take it out of the oven or before. I'm going to take them off now. A little flathead screwdriver is all it takes. And there are 4 of them, 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom. The side marker lights are a lot less work. Mine came with bulbs already in them, so I'm going to take those out. I'm going to remove the little vent cap. And I'm going to take the stud out. Now it's ready. Do the same for the other one. So now with the light disassembled comes the fun part of trying to take the lens off the housing. To do that, I'm going to put it in the oven at 325 for about 5 or 6 minutes, and I'm going to take it out and check it. I'm going to use this razor knife right here to go around the edge and try to cut the seal, and then use these dash tools as well as this putty knife to try to get it to come apart. I'm going to check it midway through. We're about 160 degrees.
Babe, what are you cooking? Seriously?
I don't think it'll hurt anything. Be sure to put on something soft. I've baked it for 5 minutes at 325 around the edge of the lens with the razor knife. Now I'm going to start with something wide, and I've been working on it a little bit just to test to make sure it was ready. And the slow turtle wins the race here. So you want to go with something that's wide, and you just get it between the glass and the housing and just work it until you hear it start to come loose. And I can hear it moving, so we're pretty close. I'm going to have to go back into the oven for just another couple of minutes, but we're real close here. Yeah, we're going to put it back in for just another couple of minutes, but it's close. Okay, round 2, after coming back out of the oven for an additional 3 minutes. Gooey, so watch when you start pulling it apart. Trying to let the glue go everywhere. And it's hot, so make sure you're wearing gloves. While the glue's hot, you can go ahead and kind of get it back in the channel as best you can, because you'll need to reuse that, and then we can come back later and clean this up after it cools off. And finally, if any of your glue smeared into your headlight bucket, when you remove the glass lens. Just use some acetone, or in my case, some of Mrs. Speedy's fingernail polish remover to wipe it out nice and clean. For the side marker lights, it's the same deal, only I'm going to bake them at 200 degrees instead of 325 because they're all plastic. And to take them apart, I'm also only going to use my plastic dash tools so that I don't gouge up any of the housing. And I've placed the light in the oven on a block of wood, a nice good thick block of wood that's non-pressure treated, lens side up. Okay, we just took it out of the oven, and again, it's a case of the slow turtle wins the race. You just want to go nice and slow around the edge. And I'm basically pushing the black backing away from the lens. Once I get a little space started with the small dash tool, I'm going to try the big one and see if I can't get a little bit more. And you'll kind of hear the glue start to move around. You'll hear it making a kind of a crunchy sound as it starts to let go, and you know you're getting close. Okay, I thought I'd mention on both of my side marker lights, the corner cracked right along here, and it's because it's so deep in the housing and that glue hangs onto it, so when you're trying to pry it out, it's easy to get leverage on that corner. It's no big deal. I just put some good glue epoxy, put the piece back on. It's a nice clean break. So just use some needle nose pliers if that happens. Pull the little piece out of the glue in the back plate and just reattach it to the lens. And you'll never see it because it'll go back on, and it's deep within the housing itself, so not a big deal. And while I'm working with the lights, I'm going to put the lenses, the glass lenses as well as the plastic ones from the side marker lamps, in a plastic bag so that the glue and the lenses stay as clean as possible. Okay, so once you have them taken apart, go ahead and remove the little reflector out of them. It's just 2 little Phillips head screws, and then tape off everything to protect your glue areas from getting contaminated, because you are going to want to reuse that glue that's on the housings to put them back together. Next, I'm going to use the wax and grease remover and one of my shop towels to thoroughly wipe down the buckets, clean them up. And then I'm going to use these red scuff pads to scuff the surface before I prime them. I like these pads better than 600 grit sandpaper because they're more flexible, and they'll conform to the shape of the housings a little bit easier. And I don't think you'd ever want to use steel wool on this, because steel wool can leave little pieces of material behind that rust in the future. And you're just scratching it up with the pad to put a little tooth on the slick plastic to give the primer something to stick a little better to. Doesn't take much. And that's what you're looking for, just a scratched up surface. Take the shine or sheen off of it a little bit, and that'll help the primer be sure to stick really well. Now we're going to wipe it down with wax and grease remover one more time, and then we're going to start priming the parts. And if you did a projector shroud, which I recommend you do because it really finishes off the light, do a test fit before you do priming and painting to make sure you don't need to trim it. Sometimes if you're doing a retrofit like this that's a universal installation, the shroud can actually make contact with the back of the headlight bucket. In my case, these Apollo 1.0 square shrouds fit the square projectors perfectly, and I don't need to do anything but Scotch Brite them with that red pad that I showed you before to scuff them up, prime them, and paint them to match the bucket. We're going to start by hitting all the parts with this adhesion promoter. It's specifically made for plastic and chrome parts, and I've used it in the past and had really good luck with it. So we're just going to shake it up, and this will be our primer. So here's where we ended up after 4 coats of paint. The Duplicolor spray does really well. I've always liked their products. They flow nice and smooth. The color almost always exactly matches the cap, so you know what you're getting. And honestly, if you wanted to just run with this, you'd probably be just fine. But since I have some clear from a previous project, I'm going to go ahead and clear coat everything. Now the perfect match, it is a acrylic lacquer, so you have to be sure if you're going to clear coat it, use an acrylic lacquer clear. That's what I've got, so that's what we're going to do next. So here's everything painted and clear coated. I did 4 coats of the magnetic gray metallic paint, followed up with 2 light coats and 1 medium wet coat of the acrylic lacquer clear. For a spray can, I'm actually pretty impressed. I did make sure I had the temperature right in the room and all that good stuff. No wind, obviously, because I'm indoors. I did wear a respirator just in case, so if you do it inside, make sure you got good ventilation and wear a mask. And I'm pretty impressed with how it turned out for about $12 in paint. So now I'm going to resist the urge to touch everything. I did pull the tape off. I always like to pull the tape off while the paint is still tacky to prevent anything from sticking and becoming brittle and tearing the paint later. So I went ahead and removed all the tape. Now I'm going to let it dry for about 24 hours before I mess with it anymore. With the side marker lights painted, I went ahead and stuck them back in the oven, 200 degrees like before, so we can get them put back together. And when you take the side marker lights back out, just reassemble them. And you want to move quickly when you take them out of the oven because the glue will harden as it cools, and it cools off pretty fast. I use some of these rubber clamps, or rubber tipped clamps I should say, to hold the light together, to put a little bit of extra tension on it as it cools. And when I checked the temperature, it seemed it was happiest at about 160 degrees at the glue seam. I kind of touched it with my finger till it felt tacky, and then I put my gloves on and put it back together. And if you end up with any of the glue residue on the lens, just use some acetone, or like I did in my case, I used Mrs. Speedy's fingernail polish remover again. And I just used that in a paper towel, and it cleaned right up. And this should be pretty obvious, but I'm going to mention it anyway. Before you reassemble the light, make sure you've cleaned the lens thoroughly inside and out, and held it at an angle to every light you can find to make sure there's nothing left on the inside, because you definitely don't want to have to take that apart again because you left some dust in there. And now that you got the side marker lights reassembled and cleaned up, go ahead and reinstall a little metal stud. You want to be very careful not over tighten it. So I used a little shorty 10mm wrench for that. And here's what the painted side marker light looks like next to the factory one. It's just a subtle change, but it's something that I think will really set the lights off when everything's put together. Okay, now I'm going to take a little bit of time and put some of this mesh loom on the exposed wires. Like I showed you earlier, some of it came with loom on it, some of it didn't. I don't know if they're in the process of transitioning over part numbers or something, you know, why this occurred, but it is what it is. One thing you want to pay attention to is your LED drivers are part specific. So let's see. You can see on that one, it says 6-inch, 190 milliamp. That means it goes with one of these 6-inch LED strips. This other one, 110 millimeter, 430 milliamp. So those drivers go with your rings. So be sure not to mix them up. Part of the assembly process is going to require me to remove this little connector on the end of the ring. And that's so that it can fit through a hole in the housing. And we want the hole to be as small as it can possibly be, so we only want to have to fit the wire. So I'm going to use one of these Weatherpak tools. It's kind of like a pick, but you can probably use a very small screwdriver or a paper clip. And I'm also going to take a magic marker, and I'm going to mark the positive side of the connector so I know I put it back together same way it came apart. And to disassemble the connector is pretty easy. Use your tool and you just press. There's a little pin there. Just press on it and it will slide out. Just like that. Do the same for the other side. Okay, and to do this, I'm going to use my butane powered soldering iron with the heat tip on it, and this is like a little heat blower, and that'll be used to melt the heat shrink. And all we're going to do is stretch the wires out, try to make them even as I can make them, and then just start feeding on your loom. And I like this stuff, you know, you got to use the right tool for the job. I like this particular kind for small wires. For larger bundles of wire, I would use the corrugated loom, but this works really good for thinner stuff. And make sure you get the kind that doesn't fray. There's two versions. The more expensive one won't fray. And you just kind of inch worm it like that. Before you know it, you'll have it installed. Okay, we've got the loom installed and trimmed. We've got our heat shrink slid over. I'm gonna get it pretty close to the end of the wires there, and I'm just gonna melt it, or heat it rather, let it shrink. You can use a lighter for this if you like. I personally like these little butane torches or soldering irons because they don't tend to burn your heat shrink. They just melt it, or shrink it rather. Okay, so there's one of the rings complete. I did both ends. I did not reinstall the connector because this is actually going to have to pass through the bucket. So I'm going to wait and put the connector on after we do that on reassembly. If you get to the male end of the driver, it's a little bit more tricky to get the wires out than the female end. You actually have to go in right above, I don't know if you can see that, the pin using your pick, and you give it a little twist, just like that. Not terribly difficult, but you got to have the right tool or it just won't work for you. So there's everything wire loomed and heat shrinked. And now we're ready to plan out how we're going to run our wiring for our LEDs inside the buckets. And I also put wire loom on the high beam solenoid wiring that came with the kit. They leave the Weatherpak connectors off, and this is so that you can run it through the bucket through a small hole. But I went ahead and just removed this end. It's really easy. It's a little clip. Depending on your setup, you'll just have to figure out how those come apart. I used my same Weatherpak tool to let the pins slide out of this little plastic connector, and then I wire loomed those as well. Next, I used a Dremel and a cutoff wheel to make some aluminum brackets for the LED strips. Now we got to prepare them for installation. And here they are prepared. I went ahead, said before, I'm a belt and suspenders kind of guy, so I drilled some small holes to use machine screws to hold them to the headlight buckets, and I'll use a little bit of JB Quick to go with them to make sure they never come loose. I've trimmed them, got them shaped the way I want them, scuffed them up with some 400 grit wet dry automotive sandpaper, and now they're ready to be cleaned up, primed, and painted. So here they are, prepped and ready to paint. You'll notice I did put a small painter's tape strip there. That is where the LED will mount, and I wanted the LED to mount straight to the aluminum rather than to paint to prevent any type of peeling or any problems. I did the same thing on the back of the bracket where it will mount to the headlight bucket. To paint aluminum, you got to use self-etching primer. I learned the hard way that regular primer just will not stick. And then I set them on a little bit of a pedestal using painter's tape and a little small roll to make sure I could get around all the edges and make it nice and uniform. Now we'll let the primer dry and then we'll hit it with some color. So here are the brackets, painted, cleared, ready to go. I do like to go ahead and pull off the painter's tape while the paint is still tacky so that it doesn't rip the paint or have any chance of doing that. So I've gone ahead and done that. And now we're just going to let them dry overnight before we mess with them anymore. Now I've mocked them up with some painter's tape just to temporarily hold the brackets in place to allow me to mark them with the small end of a Sharpie where I need to drill the holes. So we got our holes drilled. We did a nice test fit to make sure everything made sense, and it did. So now I've taped it off so we can scuff up that area to give the JB Quick something to bite against when we install the bracket. So I sanded the areas with some 400 grit wet dry sandpaper and then wiped them down with wax and grease remover. The wax and grease remover also removed quite a bit of the paint, which is what I wanted. I went down to the actual plastic or fiberglass or whatever it is these housings are made of and got them good and scuffed up so the JB Quick will be sure to stick. And now we're just going to mix it up and mount the brackets. So there's what our bracket looks like from the front. It's ready to receive the LED strip. And once I had the bracket positioned exactly where I wanted it and tightened the screws down, I put JB weld on the back to hold the nuts in place to make sure they never came loose. This is a lot of overkill probably, but once I reseal these headlights, I don't want to have any more issues with it to ever have to take it apart. Now I'm ready to mount the LED strips to the brackets, but I don't really trust this tape that's used on them. It might be great, but again, when I seal these headlights up, I don't want to have to fool with it again. So what I'm doing is I'm removing sections of the adhesive backing with an X-Acto knife, and I'm going to put JB Quick in these areas to make sure I never have any problems. So there they are, mounted up and ready to go. You see the bracket actually makes like a little pocket because the glass will go over the top, and it'll kind of make a little separate area just for the LED strips, which is what I was looking for. And when you look at them head on, you'll barely even be able to tell that bracket is there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the wire up and out about right here. I'm going to put a small hole and a grommet to run the wire through. And I chose that location because it's just above that tab and out of the way. And I started by drilling a small pilot hole, and now I'm going to go after it with the 1/4" drill bit because that's the size of my grommet. So the wires are run through and you can't see them from the front, which is what I wanted. But that's how I did it. Ran it right around through the side there, through that grommet. Now, it's a pretty tight grommet if you use the same size I did. It's a 1/4", so I used a little bit of cleaner solution like Windex to lubricate the grommet to allow the wiring to slide through a little easier. And there's what it looks like from the back side. And I did check to make sure that that won't interfere with anything when we put the light back together, and we're good to go. My OCD started to get to me a little bit, so I sprayed out some of the magnetic gray metallic onto a piece of cardboard and used a small painter's brush to come back and touch up the headlight buckets where I had to grind down those tabs to get proper projector alignment. No one would ever see that, but just knowing it was there would drive me crazy. And the final modification I made to the headlight bucket was a little bit of Dremel and sanding wheel work right in this area to enlarge the hole, and that will allow the high beam solenoid wire to run through with a little bit more room. Okay, with the headlight buckets complete, we're moving on to the shrouds and the halos. There isn't a mounting mechanism built into the shroud for halos, so we're gonna have to fabricate something. And the way I'm gonna do it is I'm gonna drill a small 1/16 hole in that tab, as well as that tab on each side. And I'm gonna run some 20-pound fishing line through, and that will hold the halo in place while I JB weld it. So there's the fishing line, and it's actually doing a really good job of holding the halo all by itself. So the JB weld will just be a little bit of extra insurance. Now, take into consideration where your wire is. I made sure to put the wire on the same side as the hole that's in the back of the headlight bucket. And I also made sure to fishing line tie it above the connection to the halo. This will protect that connection. You don't want it to pull out. So tie it there, and that way when you run the wire through the back of the bucket, it's putting tension ahead of your electrical connection. Now we're going to put some JB weld on there and we should be good to go. And there's what it looks like with the JB weld applied. I did the top and bottom as well as each side. Now we're just going to let it dry and move on to assembling the housings.